Military teacher versus bullies, YouTube script. The scissors gleamed in the fluorescent classroom light as Derek Williams lunged forward, his face twisted with rage. What he didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had disarmed trained insurgents with weapons far more dangerous than school supplies. In 3 seconds, the teenage bully would learn why you never corner a combat veteran who's dedicated her life to protecting others. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell stood in the empty hallway of Lincoln High School, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the handle of her worn leather messenger bag. The mountain air of Riverside, Colorado felt thin in her lungs, different from the humid thickness of Afghanistan, where she'd spent the last 3 years patching up wounded soldiers and learning skills she'd hoped never to use again. At 28, she was starting over in a way that felt both liberating and terrifying. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished linoleum floor. Sarah's reflection caught her eye in the glass case displaying last year's basketball trophies. She looked professional enough in her navy blazer and khaki pants, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat bun that concealed the small scar along her hairline from a roadside bomb in Kandahar. But underneath the civilian clothes, she could feel the coiled tension that never quite left her, the hypervigilance that had kept her and her unit alive through countless patrols and firefights. This was supposed to be her fresh start, her chance to channel everything she'd learned about leadership, discipline, and protecting others into something positive. Teaching English to high school students was meant to be her way of giving back, of finding purpose beyond the battlefield. Her father, Captain James Mitchell, had been skeptical when she'd told him about her career change. "Teaching's a noble profession, Sarah," he'd said over dinner at their favorite steakhouse outside Fort Carson. "But these kids today, they're not like the soldiers you're used to working with. They don't have the same respect for authority, the same sense of discipline." Sarah had nodded, understanding his concerns, but she'd felt a calling to work with young people who were still forming their identities, still capable of change. She'd seen too much destruction in her military career. She wanted to build something instead of constantly reacting to violence and chaos. The job at Lincoln High had seemed perfect when she'd interviewed over video call. A small mountain town, a tight-knit community, students who might benefit from her unique perspective on life and resilience. Principal Robert Chen had been enthusiastic during their meeting, his kind eyes lighting up behind wire-rimmed glasses as he discussed the school's needs. "We've had some challenges with classroom management," he'd admitted, adjusting his tie nervously. "Budget cuts mean larger class sizes, and we've lost some experienced teachers to districts that can pay more. But we believe in our students, and we think someone with your background could really make a difference." Sarah had felt optimistic then, energized by the possibility of channeling her protective instincts into nurturing young minds. She'd spent the summer preparing lesson plans, designing activities that would engage reluctant readers, and setting up her classroom with the same attention to detail she'd once applied to organizing medical supplies in field hospitals. Every corner of room 204 had been carefully arranged to create a safe, welcoming environment where learning could flourish. The reality of Lincoln High had hit her like a tactical assessment gone wrong. The building itself was showing its age, with peeling paint in the stairwells and classroom ceiling tiles that occasionally dropped without warning. The hallways echoed with a chaotic energy that reminded her uncomfortably of the crowded bazaars in Kabul, where danger could emerge from any direction without warning. But it wasn't the physical condition of the school that troubled her most. It was the atmosphere. During her first week, Sarah had quickly identified the social dynamics that governed student behavior. Like any military unit, Lincoln High operated on an unofficial hierarchy that had little to do with official rules and everything to do with perceived power and influence. At the top of this hierarchy was Derek Williams, a 17-year-old senior who carried himself with the swagger of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Derek was tall and athletic, with sandy brown hair that he wore deliberately tousled and a cocky smile that seemed to work on adults who didn't look too closely. His family had money, which bought him expensive clothes and the latest technology, but more importantly, it bought him influence. His father owned the largest construction company in Riverside, employing the fathers of several other students and contributing generously to school fundraisers. This created a protective bubble around Derek that made teachers and administrators reluctant to challenge his behavior too directly. Flanking Derek were his two constant companions, Brandon Torres and Kyle Johnson. Brandon was a year younger but physically imposing, with broad shoulders from years of wrestling and a hair-trigger temper that had earned him multiple suspensions. His loyalty to Derek seemed absolute, rooted in a combination of genuine friendship and the social status that came with being part of the popular crowd. Kyle was different, quieter and more insecure, but he followed Derek's lead with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who'd found acceptance and was terrified of losing it. Together, the three of them had created a reign of terror that extended far beyond typical teenage drama. Sarah had witnessed their behavior during lunch duty, watching them systematically target younger students with a cruelty that was both casual and calculated. They'd perfected the art of psychological intimidation, knowing exactly how to push boundaries without crossing lines that would result in serious disciplinary action. Mrs. Linda Foster, a veteran teacher who'd been at Lincoln High for over 20 years, had briefed Sarah during orientation with the weary tone of someone who'd seen too much. "Derek and his crew are smart about it," she'd explained, stirring sugar into her coffee in the cramped teacher's lounge. "They know how to make it look like harmless fun, how to gaslight their victims into thinking they're overreacting. The administration has tried to address it, but Derek's father makes substantial donations to the school district. It's a delicate situation." Sarah had nodded, filing away the information while making her own assessments. In the military, she'd learned to identify potential threats and neutralize them before they could escalate. But this was different. These were children, technically, even if some of them were nearly adults. They deserved patience, guidance, and the chance to learn from their mistakes. She'd committed to giving them that opportunity, even if it meant enduring some initial testing of boundaries. The testing had begun almost immediately. During her first day teaching, Derek had sauntered into her classroom 5 minutes late, making no effort to apologize or explain his tardiness. He'd chosen a seat in the back corner, leaning his chair against the wall with deliberate disrespect, while scrolling through his phone. When Sarah had politely asked him to put the device away, he'd looked up with mock surprise and said, "Oh, sorry, Miss Mitchell. I didn't realize you were talking to me." The calculated innocence in his voice had been perfectly calibrated to sound respectful to any administrator who might overhear, while simultaneously conveying complete dismissal to everyone else in the room. Sarah had felt her jaw tighten slightly, recognizing the tactic. She'd dealt with insubordinate soldiers before, but there had been clear protocols for addressing disrespect in the military. Here, she was navigating unfamiliar territory, with rules that seemed designed to protect disruptive students, rather than maintain order. "Please put your phone away, Derek," she'd repeated, keeping her voice steady and professional. "We're discussing the themes in Of Mice and Men, and I'd like everyone to participate in the conversation." Derek had made a show of slowly placing his phone on his desk, face up so the screen remained visible. "There we go, Miss Mitchell. Happy now?" The rest of the class had watched this exchange with the fascinated attention of spectators at a sporting event. Sarah had realized that this was more than simple teenage rebellion. Derek was establishing dominance, testing her limits, and demonstrating to his peers that he didn't recognize her authority. It was a power play that required careful handling. "Thank you," she'd said simply, then turned back to the whiteboard to continue her lesson. She'd chosen not to escalate the confrontation, hoping that consistency and patience would eventually win over her most challenging students. But she'd also made a mental note to document the incident and begin building a case for more serious intervention if Derek's behavior continued. The pattern had repeated itself daily, with variations that kept Sarah constantly off balance. Derek would arrive late, disrupt discussions with inappropriate comments, and encourage other students to test boundaries. Brandon would contribute by making loud, exaggerated yawns during lessons or suddenly dropping his textbook to create jarring noises. Kyle's contributions were more subtle but equally disruptive, such as asking elaborate questions designed to derail conversations or waste time. What troubled Sarah most was the effect their behavior had on other students. Emma Rodriguez, a quiet sophomore who showed genuine interest in literature, had stopped participating in class discussions after Derek mocked one of her thoughtful observations about character development. Other students seemed to walk on eggshells, afraid to engage meaningfully with the material for fear of becoming targets themselves. Sarah had tried various approaches to address the situation. She'd spoken with Derek privately after class, attempting to understand what was driving his behavior, and offering him leadership opportunities that might channel his influence in positive directions. She'd contacted parents, restructured her classroom management system, and even consulted with the school counselor about strategies for dealing with challenging students. Nothing had worked. If anything, Derek seemed to interpret her efforts as weakness, escalating his disruptions and recruiting other students to join his campaign of subtle rebellion. Sarah had begun to feel like she was losing control of her classroom, and with it, her ability to create the safe learning environment she'd envisioned. The breaking point had been building for weeks, but Sarah hadn't recognized the signs until it was too late. Derek's behavior had become increasingly aggressive, his comments more personal and targeted. He'd started making veiled references to her military service, asking fake innocent questions about whether she'd killed anyone over there, and suggesting that maybe she should go back to playing soldier if she couldn't handle real kids. These comments had stung more than Sarah cared to admit. Her military service was something she was proud of, but it was also deeply personal. She'd seen friends die, had held dying soldiers in her arms, and had made split-second decisions that haunted her dreams. To have a teenager mock that experience while simultaneously creating chaos in her classroom felt like a betrayal of everything she'd hoped to accomplish as a teacher. The final straw had come on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. Sarah had been working alone in her classroom after school, grading papers and preparing for the next day's lessons. The building was largely empty, except for custodial staff and a few teachers staying late to catch up on work. She'd been focused on providing detailed feedback on student essays when she'd heard, "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Voices in the hallway outside her door. "She thinks she's so tough with her military stuff." Derek's voice had carried clearly through the thin walls. "But she's just another teacher who can't control her classroom. Watch this." Sarah had looked up from her papers, her military training automatically assessing the situation. 3 sets of footsteps were approaching her door, and the tone of the conversation suggested hostile intent. She'd quickly saved her work and stood up, positioning herself where she could see the doorway while maintaining access to multiple exit routes. Derek had appeared in the doorway first, followed by Brandon and Kyle. They'd entered her classroom without permission, their body language deliberately aggressive and territorial. Derek had been carrying a pair of scissors from the art room, turning them over in his hands with practiced nonchalance that didn't fool Sarah for a second. "Miss Mitchell," Derek had said, his voice dripping with false politeness, "we wanted to talk to you about our grades." Sarah had felt her pulse quicken slightly, but her voice had remained steady. "Office hours are tomorrow during lunch, Derek. You'll need to leave the classroom now." "Oh, but we're here now," Brandon had said, stepping closer. "And we have some concerns about how you've been treating students in this class." Sarah had recognized the setup immediately. They were creating a confrontation, probably recording it on their phones to share later or use as evidence that she'd been aggressive toward students. She'd dealt with similar situations in combat zones, where insurgents would provoke reactions they could later use for propaganda purposes. "I understand you have concerns," she'd said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "But this isn't the appropriate time or place to discuss them. Please leave my classroom and we'll schedule a proper meeting." Derek had laughed, a sound that held no humor. "You know what, Miss Mitchell? I don't think you understand how things work around here. You're new, and you're trying to change things that have worked fine for years. Maybe it's time someone explained the situation to you." He'd taken a step closer, still playing with the scissors, and Sarah had felt something fundamental shift in her assessment of the situation. This wasn't just teenage rebellion anymore. Derek was escalating toward physical confrontation, and she was alone with 3 students who clearly had no respect for boundaries or consequences. "Derek," she'd said, her voice taking on a tone that any soldier would have recognized as a final warning, "you need to leave. Now." "Or what?" Derek had asked, his mask of false politeness finally dropping. "What are you going to do about it, Army girl? Are you going to call for backup? Are you going to cry about how mean we're being to you?" Sarah had felt her training kick in, her mind automatically calculating distances, potential weapons, and exit strategies. But she'd also felt something else. A deep sadness that it had come to this. These were kids who should have been learning about literature and critical thinking, not learning how to intimidate and threaten adults. "I'm asking you one more time to leave my classroom," she'd said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that came from years of commanding respect in life-or-death situations. Derek's response had been to raise the scissors, pointing them directly at her chest. "Make me." In that moment, Sarah had realized that all her hopes for reaching these students through patience and understanding had been naive. Derek wasn't a confused teenager acting out because of personal problems. He was a bully who had learned that aggression and intimidation could get him what he wanted, and he was escalating toward violence because he'd never faced real consequences for his actions. The scissors had caught the fluorescent light as Derek had taken another step forward, and Sarah had felt her military training override her civilian instincts. She was no longer a teacher trying to nurture young minds. She was a combat veteran facing a threat, and she knew exactly how to handle it. "Derek," she'd said, her voice dropping to a level that made all three boys take an involuntary step backward. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." The transformation in her demeanor had been instant and complete. Her posture had shifted from the slightly defensive stance of a concerned teacher to the balanced, ready position of someone trained to neutralize threats. Her eyes had hardened, and suddenly the classroom felt smaller, more dangerous. "What did you just say to me?" Derek had demanded, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "I said you have no idea what you're dealing with," Sarah had repeated, taking a single step forward. "You think those scissors make you dangerous? You think threatening a teacher is going to get you what you want?" For the first time since she'd known him, Derek had looked genuinely uncertain. The scissors had wavered in his hand, and Sarah had seen him glance toward his friends for support. But Brandon and Kyle had both taken another step backward, their earlier bravado evaporating in the face of something they couldn't quite understand. "You're just a teacher," Derek had said, but his voice had lacked conviction. "No," Sarah had said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 tours in Afghanistan, countless lives saved, and skills honed in the most dangerous places on Earth. "I'm a United States Army combat medic who spent 3 years keeping soldiers alive while people with real weapons tried to kill us. And you're a spoiled teenager with a pair of safety scissors thinking you can intimidate me." The silence that had followed had been deafening. Derek had stared at her, the scissors still raised but no longer seeming like a weapon. Sarah had seen the exact moment when he'd realized that he'd miscalculated, that the quiet teacher he'd been tormenting for weeks was something else entirely. "Now," Sarah had continued, her voice never rising but carrying absolute authority, "you're going to put those scissors down, walk out of my classroom, and we're going to have a very different conversation about respect and consequences." Derek had stood frozen for a moment, caught between his need to maintain face in front of his friends and his growing realization that he was completely out of his depth. Sarah had waited, letting him process the new reality of their relationship. "I'm not afraid of you," Derek had said finally, but his voice had cracked slightly. "You should be," Sarah had replied simply. "Not because I want to hurt you, but because you've just threatened a teacher with a weapon. That's assault, Derek. That's expulsion. That's criminal charges. And unlike the other teachers you've bullied, I'm not going to pretend this didn't happen." The weight of her words had settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Derek had finally lowered the scissors, his hand shaking slightly as he'd placed them on a nearby desk. Brandon and Kyle had moved even closer to the door, clearly ready to flee if the situation escalated further. "This isn't over," Derek had said, but the threat had sounded hollow. "Yes, it is," Sarah had replied with absolute certainty. "This is completely over. Your reign of terror in this school, your bullying of other students, your disrespect for teachers and authority figures. All of it ends right now." She'd moved to her desk, never taking her eyes off the 3 students, and had picked up her phone. "I'm calling Principal Chen, and then I'm calling the police. You threatened a teacher with a weapon, and there are going to be consequences." Derek had finally broken, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. "Wait, you don't understand. I wasn't really going to hurt you. It was just a joke. A prank. We were just messing around." "No," Sarah had said, dialing the principal's number. "You were threatening me with a weapon. The intent doesn't matter. The action does. And actions have consequences." As she'd waited for Principal Chen to answer, Sarah had felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She'd neutralized the immediate threat, But she'd also acknowledged that her dream of reaching these students through patience and understanding had been naive. Some people, regardless of their age, only respected strength and consequences. The phone had rung twice before Principal Chen's voice had come through. "Sarah? Is everything okay?" "Mr. Chen," Sarah had said, her voice steady and professional. "I need you to come to my classroom immediately. I've just been threatened with a weapon by Derek Williams, and I need to file a formal incident report." The silence on the other end of the line had stretched for several seconds. "I'll be right there," Principal Chen had said finally. "Don't let anyone leave." Sarah had hung up and looked at the three students, who were now huddled near the door, like cornered animals. Derek's face had been pale, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. Brandon and Kyle had looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. "Sit down," Sarah had ordered, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "All of you, don't speak, don't move, and don't even think about leaving. You're going to wait here until the principal arrives, and then you're going to explain to him exactly what happened." They'd obeyed immediately, taking seats in the front row with the defeated posture of prisoners awaiting sentencing. Derek had stared at his hands, the scissors forgotten on the desk where he'd placed them. The cocky teenager who'd terrorized students and teachers for months had been replaced by a scared kid who'd finally realized that actions had consequences. Sarah had remained standing, her military training keeping her alert and ready despite the fact that the immediate threat had passed. She'd spent 3 years in situations where relaxing too soon could be fatal, and those instincts were hard to shake. But she'd also felt a deep sense of satisfaction. For the first time since arriving at Lincoln High, she'd felt like herself again. Not the tentative, uncertain teacher who'd been trying to fit into civilian life, but the confident, capable woman who'd earned her place in one of the most demanding professions in the world. The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway had announced Principal Chen's arrival. He'd appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath, his usually neat appearance disheveled from his rush across the building. His eyes had immediately taken in the scene. Sarah standing calmly by her desk, 3 students seated in the front row looking miserable, and a pair of scissors lying conspicuously on a nearby desk. "What happened?" Principal Chen had asked, his voice carefully neutral. Sarah had launched into a clear, factual account of the incident, her military training serving her well in delivering a concise, yet comprehensive briefing. She'd described Derek's escalating behavior over the past weeks, the after-school confrontation, and the moment when he'd threatened her with the scissors. She'd spoken without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. Principal Chen had listened intently, occasionally glancing at the 3 students who'd remained silent throughout her report. When she'd finished, he'd turned to Derek with a look of profound disappointment. "Derek," he'd said quietly, "is this true?" Derek had looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Mr. Chen, it wasn't like that. We were just talking to her about our grades, and she freaked out. She started acting all crazy and military-like, and we got scared. You were carrying scissors," Principal Chen had pointed out. "I brought them to return them to the art room," Derek had said quickly. "I wasn't threatening anyone." She misunderstood the situation. Sarah had watched this exchange with the detached interest of someone who'd seen many desperate people try to talk their way out of consequences. Derek's story had holes that anyone could see, but she'd recognized the pattern. He was trying to gaslight the situation, to make her seem unstable and unreasonable. "Mr. Chen," she'd said calmly, "I'd like to point out that Derek and his friends entered my classroom without permission while I was working alone. They approached me in a threatening manner, and Derek explicitly raised the scissors and told me to make him leave when I asked him to go. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a joke. This was a calculated attempt to intimidate me." Principal Chen had nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. "Derek, even if your version is true, you had no business being in this classroom after hours without permission. And carrying scissors from another room suggests premeditation. It's not fair," Derek had protested, his voice rising. "She's been targeting me since the first day of school. She doesn't like me, and she's trying to get me in trouble." "Actually," Sarah had said, reaching into her desk drawer, "I've been documenting every incident in this classroom since school started. I have detailed records of disruptions, inappropriate comments, and behavioral issues. This didn't happen in isolation, Mr. Chen. This was the culmination of weeks of escalating behavior. She'd handed him a folder containing her careful documentation, and Principal Chen had flipped through it with growing concern. Page after page of incidents, each one carefully dated and described, painted a picture of systematic harassment and intimidation. "Derek," Principal Chen had said finally, "this is very serious. Threatening a teacher with any object can be considered assault. I'm going to have to call your parents, and we'll need to discuss possible criminal charges." Derek had finally broken down completely, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his situation had crashed down on him. "Please don't call my dad," he'd begged. "He'll kill me. I'm sorry, okay? I'm really sorry. I didn't mean it." Sarah had felt no satisfaction in seeing the teenager cry. If anything, she'd felt sad that it had come to this, that a young person had been allowed to spiral so far out of control before facing real consequences. "I'm sorry too, Derek," she'd said quietly. "I'm sorry that no one helped you understand that actions have consequences before it came to this. But threatening a teacher with a weapon is where the line gets drawn." Principal Chen had spent the next hour making phone calls, filling out incident reports, and dealing with the immediate aftermath of the situation. Derek's parents had arrived within 30 minutes, his father's face red with anger and embarrassment. The police had been called, and while they'd ultimately decided not to file criminal charges given Derek's age and lack of criminal history, they'd made it clear that any future incidents would result in serious legal consequences. The school board had met in emergency session that evening, and Derek had been expelled pending a full investigation. Brandon and Kyle had received 2-week suspensions for their roles in the incident, and all 3 students had been banned from school property except for official meetings with administrators. Word of the confrontation had spread through the school like wildfire, though the details had been distorted and exaggerated with each telling. Some students claimed that Sarah had physically fought all 3 boys. Others insisted that Derek had actually tried to stab her. The truth, as Sarah had learned, was often less dramatic than the stories people preferred to tell. What mattered was that the dynamic at Lincoln High had changed overnight. Students who had previously been intimidated by Derek and his crew began to speak up about their experiences. Teachers who had been afraid to confront disruptive behavior started enforcing their classroom rules more consistently. And Sarah had found herself regarded with a new kind of respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the recognition that some people were willing to stand up for what was right. The weeks following the incident had been a period of adjustment for everyone involved. Sarah had worried that her military background would make her seem unapproachable or threatening to students. But the opposite had proven true. Students seemed to respect her more, not because they were afraid of her, but because they understood that she had clear boundaries and would enforce them fairly. Emma Rodriguez had been the first to approach her after the incident, staying after class to express her gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Mitchell," she'd said quietly. "Derek made school miserable for a lot of us, and nobody ever stood up to him before." Other students had followed, sharing their own stories of intimidation and harassment. Sarah had realized that Derek's behavior had affected far more people than she'd initially understood, creating an atmosphere of fear that had poisoned the entire school environment. The change in classroom dynamics had been immediate and profound. Without Derek's disruptive influence, students began participating more actively in discussions. The quality of work improved, and Sarah had finally been able to create the engaging, supportive learning environment she'd envisioned when she'd first decided to become a teacher. But the most significant change had been in Sarah herself. She'd found a way to integrate her military experience with her civilian goals, using her training and skills to protect and serve in a different way. She'd learned that strength and compassion weren't mutually exclusive, that sometimes the most caring thing a person could do was to establish clear boundaries and enforce them consistently. 3 months after the incident, Sarah had received an unexpected visitor. Derek Williams had appeared at her classroom door after school, looking older and more subdued than she remembered. He'd been attending a private school in Denver while completing community service and anger management counseling as part of his agreement with the school board. "Miss Mitchell," he'd said, his voice lacking any of its former arrogance, "I wanted to apologize. Not because I have to, but because I need to." Sarah had invited him to sit down, curious about what had prompted this visit. Derek had looked around the classroom where he'd once caused so much disruption and she'd seen genuine remorse in his eyes. "I've been thinking about what happened," he'd continued. "About what I did, and why I did it. I was angry about a lot of things, and I took it out on people who didn't deserve it. I took it out on you, and I'm sorry." "What were you angry about?" Sarah had asked gently. Derek had been quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "My parents are getting divorced," he'd said finally. "They'd been fighting for months, and I felt like everything was falling apart. I guess I wanted to make someone else feel as powerless as I felt." Sarah had nodded, understanding the psychology behind his behavior. "That doesn't excuse what you did, Derek, but it helps me understand it." "I know it doesn't excuse it," Derek had said. "I made other people suffer because I was suffering, and that's not okay. I hurt you, I hurt other students, and I created a toxic environment for everyone. I'm sorry." "I appreciate you coming here to tell me that," Sarah had said. "It takes courage to face the people you've hurt and take responsibility for your actions." Derek had smiled slightly, the first genuine expression she'd ever seen from him. "I'm learning a lot about courage lately. Real courage, not the fake kind I thought I had before." They'd talked for another 20 minutes, and Sarah had been struck by how much Derek had changed. The angry, entitled teenager had been replaced by a young man who was genuinely trying to understand himself and make amends for his mistakes. "Can I ask you something?" Derek had said as he'd prepared to leave. "Of course. That day in the classroom, when I had the scissors, were you really going to hurt me?" Sarah had considered the question carefully. "If you had actually tried to attack me, I would have stopped you using whatever force was necessary. But I never wanted to hurt you, Derek. I wanted to protect myself and help you understand that there are consequences to threatening people." Derek had nodded slowly. "I think I understand now. You weren't trying to scare me. You were trying to save me from myself." "That's exactly right," Sarah had said. "Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is to refuse to enable their destructive behavior." Derek had stood to leave, then paused at the door. "For what it's worth, Miss Mitchell, you're a good teacher. I'm sorry it took me so long to realize that." After he'd left, Sarah had sat in her quiet classroom and reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd come to Lincoln High hoping to make a difference in young people's lives. But she'd learned that making a difference sometimes required difficult choices and uncomfortable confrontations. Her military training had prepared her for many things, but it had also taught her the most important lesson of all, that protecting people sometimes meant standing up to bullies, whether they were insurgents in Afghanistan or troubled teenagers in Colorado. The uniform had changed, but the mission remained the same. Sarah had looked around her classroom, at the student artwork on the walls and the carefully arranged desks, and had felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was where she belonged, where her skills and experience could serve a purpose beyond warfare. She was still a protector, still a servant of something greater than herself. The next morning, she'd walked into Lincoln High, with her head held high, ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. She'd found her place in the world, and she'd earned it through strength, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The scared, uncertain teacher who'd started the school year questioning her decision to leave the military was gone, replaced by a confident educator who understood that teaching was just another form of service. And in room 204, where scissors had once been raised in anger, students were learning not just about literature and writing, but about courage, consequences, and the kind of strength that came from standing up for what was right. Sarah Mitchell had found her mission, and she was ready to serve. The days following Sarah's initial encounters with Derek Williams and his followers settled into a pattern that felt disturbingly familiar to her military experience. In Afghanistan, she'd learned to recognize the rhythm of insurgent tactics, the way small provocations would escalate into larger conflicts if left unchecked. The same dynamics were playing out in the halls of Lincoln High, but without the clear rules of engagement that had governed her previous life. Derek's campaign against her had evolved from simple classroom disruption to something more calculated and personal. He'd begun arriving to class exactly on time, eliminating her ability to address his tardiness, but he'd replaced that obvious defiance with subtler forms of psychological warfare. He would sit in the back row and maintain steady eye contact with Sarah throughout her lessons. not participating or responding when called upon, but creating an atmosphere of silent hostility that was impossible to ignore. The technique was sophisticated in its simplicity. Derek wasn't breaking any specific rules that Sarah could document or report. He was attending class, sitting quietly, and avoiding overt disruption. But his presence had become a dark cloud that affected everyone in the room. Other students seemed to sense the tension, becoming quieter and more reserved when Derek was present. Class discussions that had begun to flourish in her other periods would die abruptly when students noticed Derek's disapproving stare. Sarah had dealt with similar psychological operations in combat zones, where enemy combatants would use intimidation and fear to control civilian populations without direct confrontation. The goals were the same: establish dominance, undermine authority, and create an environment where resistance seemed futile. But in Afghanistan, she'd had clear protocols for dealing with such tactics. Here, she was navigating a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to protect disruptive students rather than maintain order. Brendan Torres had taken a different approach to harassment, one that played to his strengths as a physically imposing presence. He'd begun positioning himself in Sarah's path throughout the school day, forcing her to navigate around him in hallways or wait while he slowly gathered his materials after class. The actions were always technically innocent. He was just walking slowly or taking his time to pack his bag or stopping to tie his shoe at inconvenient moments. But the cumulative effect was to make Sarah feel constantly obstructed and off balance. The psychological impact was more significant than the physical inconvenience. Sarah had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan by maintaining situational awareness and controlling her environment. Brandon's tactics were designed to make her feel like she had no control, like she was constantly reacting to obstacles rather than moving purposefully through her day. It was a sophisticated form of harassment that would be difficult to explain to administrators who hadn't experienced it themselves. Kyle Johnson's contribution to the campaign was perhaps the most insidious, because it targeted Sarah's professional competence directly. He'd begun asking elaborate, time-consuming questions during class that were technically related to the material but were clearly designed to derail lessons and waste valuable instructional time. He would raise his hand with expressions of genuine confusion and launch into complex hypothetical scenarios that required lengthy explanations. "Miss Mitchell," Kyle would say, his voice carrying the perfect tone of earnest curiosity, "I'm having trouble understanding why Lenny's character represents the American dream and of mice and men. Could you explain how someone with his mental limitations could symbolize hope when the other characters seem to view him as a burden? And also, how does that relate to the historical context of the Great Depression? Because I read online that people with disabilities were often institutionalized during that time period, so wouldn't that make Steinbeck's portrayal unrealistic?" The questions were sophisticated enough to seem legitimate, but they were clearly designed to consume class time and frustrate Sarah's attempts to maintain lesson momentum. She couldn't simply dismiss them without appearing unprofessional, but addressing them fully would eat up significant portions of her carefully planned instructional periods. Kyle had found a way to weaponize his own education against her, using academic discourse as a tool for disruption. The 3 students had also begun coordinating their efforts in ways that created a constant state of low-level chaos in Sarah's classroom. They would arrive at staggered intervals, ensuring that each entrance disrupted the flow of whatever activity was in progress. They would request bathroom passes at different times, creating a steady stream of interruptions. They would ask to visit the nurse, the counselor, or the main office, always with vague complaints that couldn't be verified but had to be taken seriously. Sarah had begun to feel like she was running a medical triage unit rather than an English classroom. Every day brought new requests for accommodations, new complaints about feeling unwell, new demands for her attention and time. The 3 students had effectively hijacked her classroom management system, using her own professionalism and concern for student welfare against her. But the most damaging aspect of their campaign wasn't the direct harassment. It was the way their behavior had begun to influence other students and even fellow teachers. Sarah had noticed that some of her more timid students had stopped participating in class discussions entirely, apparently afraid that engaging with the material would make them targets for Derek's circle. Others had begun adopting similar disruptive behaviors, testing boundaries that Derek had already pushed. The ripple effects extended beyond her classroom. During lunch duty, Sarah observed Derek and his followers approaching younger students with the same calculated intimidation they used on her. They would surround a freshman at his locker, not quite touching him but creating a wall of bodies that made escape impossible. They would make comments about his appearance, his backpack, his lunch choices, always stopping just short of anything that would trigger official intervention. Sarah had watched one such encounter involving a slight boy named Marcus. Chen, Principal Chen's nephew, who'd been trying to navigate to his next class when Derek's group had cornered him near the water fountains. They'd formed a semicircle around the younger student, forcing him to face them while blocking his path forward. "Hey, Marcus," Derek had said, his voice carrying false friendliness that made the threat more obvious. "Nice shirt, man. Is that from the kids section at Walmart?" Brandon had laughed on cue, the sound echoing off the hallway walls. "I think my little sister has that same shirt. She's 8. Kyle had contributed his own observation. "Maybe his mom shops in the wrong department. Easy mistake to make when your kid is so small." Marcus had stood frozen, his face reddening with embarrassment while other students walked past, carefully avoiding eye contact. Sarah had felt her jaw clench as she'd watched the systematic humiliation unfold. This wasn't teenage teasing. This was calculated cruelty designed to establish dominance and create lasting psychological damage. "Excuse me," Sarah had said, approaching the group with her teacher voice fully engaged. "Don't you all have somewhere to be?" Derek had turned to her with that same false smile he'd perfected. "Just talking to our friend Marcus here, Miss Mitchell. Nothing wrong with being social, right?" "Class starts in 2 minutes," Sarah had said firmly. "Everyone needs to move along." The group had dispersed, but not before Derek had made a point of patting Marcus on the shoulder in a gesture that looked friendly to observers but was clearly intended as a final intimidation. "See you later, Marcus," he'd said, the promise unmistakable. Sarah had watched Marcus hurry away, his shoulders hunched with defeat, and had felt the same helpless anger she'd experienced when witnessing civilian casualties in Afghanistan. The systems that were supposed to protect the vulnerable were failing, and the predators were adapting faster than the defenders could respond. She'd tried to address the situation through official channels, documenting incidents and requesting meetings with administrators, but the response had been frustratingly inadequate. Principal Chen was well-meaning but overwhelmed, dealing with budget cuts, staff shortages, and pressure from the district office to maintain standardized test scores. The guidance counselor was spread thin across the entire student body, and the handful of security personnel were focused on more obvious threats like weapons and drugs. "These are smart kids," Principal Chen had explained during one of their meetings, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd been fighting losing battles for years. "They know exactly how to push boundaries without crossing lines that would trigger serious consequences." Derek's father is on the school board, and he's made it clear that any disciplinary action needs to be thoroughly justified and documented. Sarah had left that meeting feeling more frustrated than ever. The very intelligence and sophistication that should have made Derek a leader among his peers had been turned into tools for systematic harassment. He'd created a reign of terror that was perfectly calibrated to avoid detection while maximizing psychological damage. The situation had begun affecting Sarah's performance as a teacher in ways that went beyond simple frustration. She'd started losing sleep, lying awake at night replaying classroom incidents and trying to develop strategies for dealing with increasingly creative forms of disruption. Her lesson plans had become defensive documents, focused more on anticipating and preventing problems than on engaging students with meaningful content. She'd found herself becoming hypervigilant in ways that reminded her uncomfortably of her deployment experiences. In Afghanistan, constant alertness had been necessary for survival. Here, it was a response to psychological warfare that was wearing her down day by day. She would arrive at school each morning with her shoulders tense, her jaw clenched, and her mind already racing through potential scenarios and responses. The physical toll was becoming apparent to her colleagues. Mrs. Linda Foster had pulled her aside after a faculty meeting to express concern about her appearance and demeanor. "Sarah, you look exhausted," the veteran teacher had said, her voice gentle but worried. "Are you taking care of yourself? This job can be demanding, but it shouldn't be making you sick." Sarah had wanted to explain about Derek's campaign, about the systematic harassment that was making her daily life miserable. But she'd also recognized that her complaints might sound paranoid or exaggerated to someone who hadn't experienced the full scope of the psychological manipulation. "I'm fine," she'd said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just adjusting to the demands of teaching. I'm sure it'll get easier." Mrs. Foster had looked skeptical, but hadn't pressed the issue. If you need to talk, or if you need help with anything, please don't hesitate to ask. We've all been through difficult periods with challenging students. But Sarah had doubted that any of her colleagues had dealt with anything quite like Derek Williams. His campaign wasn't the typical acting out of a troubled teenager. It was a sophisticated psychological operation designed to break down her confidence and authority through systematic, coordinated harassment. The breaking point had been approaching for weeks, but Sarah hadn't recognized the signs until it was too late. Derek's behavior had become increasingly aggressive, his comments more personal and targeted. He'd started making veiled references to her military service, asking fake innocent questions about whether she'd killed anyone over there, and suggesting that maybe she should go back to playing soldier if she couldn't handle real kids. The comments had been delivered with perfect timing and tone, always when other students were present, but no other adults were within earshot. Derek had developed an instinct for finding moments when Sarah was most vulnerable, when she was dealing with multiple demands and couldn't respond effectively to his provocations. "Miss Mitchell," he'd said during one particularly difficult day when she'd been juggling a fire drill, a parent conference, and a student who'd been sent to her classroom for disciplinary reasons. "I heard that soldiers sometimes get, PTSD? Is that why you seem so jumpy all the time?" The question had been asked with such apparent concern that other students had looked at Sarah with interest rather than recognizing it as an attack. Derek had found a way to weaponize her service record, using her military experience as a source of shame rather than pride. Sarah had felt her control slipping in that moment, her careful professional demeanor cracking under the pressure of sustained harassment. The teenager in front of her wasn't just being disruptive or difficult. He was trying to break her, to force her into reactions that would justify his behavior and undermine her authority. "That's not an appropriate question, Derek," she'd said, her voice tighter than she'd intended. "I'm just concerned about you," Derek had replied, his tone shifting to mock sympathy. "You seem really stressed lately. Maybe teaching isn't the right job for someone with your background." Other students had sensed the tension in the room, some looking uncomfortable with Derek's obvious hostility, while others watched with the fascination of spectators at a sporting event. Sarah had realized that she was losing control of the situation, that Derek was successfully turning her own classroom into a battleground where he held the advantage. The pattern had continued for days, with Derek escalating his personal attacks while maintaining the facade of concerned student asking legitimate questions. He'd begun researching her military service online, finding news articles about her unit's deployment, and using the information to craft increasingly specific and hurtful comments. "I read that your unit lost some people in Afghanistan," he'd said during one class, his voice carrying false sympathy. "That must have been hard, watching people die when you were supposed to save them. Do you ever think about how you failed them?" The comment had hit Sarah like a physical blow, targeting her deepest fears and insecurities about her service record. She'd saved many lives during her deployment, but she'd also lost patients, soldiers who died despite her best efforts. The guilt and grief were wounds that had never fully healed, and Derek had found a way to weaponize them. "That's enough," Sarah had said, her voice carrying a warning that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I'm just trying to understand why you left the military," Derek had pressed, apparently emboldened by her visible distress. "I mean, if you were good at your job, why did you quit? Did something happen that made you unfit for service?" Sarah had felt her military training warring with her civilian instincts. Every fiber of her being had wanted to respond to Derek's provocation with the kind of decisive action that would have been appropriate in a combat zone. But she'd also known that any aggressive response would be exactly what he wanted, giving him ammunition to use against her with administrators and parents. "We're done with this conversation," she'd said, turning back to the whiteboard with hands that shook slightly from suppressed anger. "I'm sorry if I upset you," Derek had said, his voice carrying mock contrition. "I was just curious about your background. I thought teachers were supposed to encourage questions." The gaslighting had been perfectly executed, turning Sarah's legitimate anger into evidence of her own instability. Derek had created a situation where she looked unreasonable for objecting to his harassment, while positioning himself as an innocent student pursuing legitimate academic inquiry. The campaign had continued for weeks, with Derek, Brandon, and Kyle coordinating their efforts to create a constant state of low-level crisis in Sarah's classroom. They'd perfected the art of plausible deniability, always having innocent explanations for their disruptive behavior while systematically undermining her authority and effectiveness as a teacher. Sarah had begun to feel like she was fighting a war with both hands tied behind her back. The rules of engagement in civilian life seemed designed to protect the aggressors while leaving their victims defenseless. She'd started questioning her decision to leave the military, wondering if she'd made a mistake in thinking she could succeed in an environment where strength and decisiveness were discouraged. The situation had reached a crescendo during the week before the scissors incident. Derek had escalated his psychological warfare to include threats against other students, using his campaign against Sarah as a model for broader intimidation tactics. He'd begun targeting Emma Rodriguez more aggressively, making comments about her appearance and academic performance that were designed to silence her completely. Sarah had watched Emma withdraw further into herself, her contributions to class discussions becoming non-existent as she tried to avoid Derek's attention. The transformation had been heartbreaking to witness, a bright and thoughtful student being systematically destroyed by a bully who faced no meaningful consequences for his actions. "Miss Mitchell," Emma had said after class one day, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't think I can take this class anymore. Could you help me transfer to a different section?" "Why?" Sarah had asked, though she'd already known the answer. "Derek and his friends make me feel stupid," Emma had admitted, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Every time I try to participate, they make faces or comments that make me feel like I don't belong here. I can't concentrate when they're around." Sarah had felt something fundamental shift in her chest as she looked at Emma's defeated posture. This wasn't just about her own professional challenges anymore. Derek's campaign had begun destroying other students' educational experiences, creating an atmosphere of fear that was poisoning the entire learning environment. "Emma," Sarah had said gently, "you're one of the most thoughtful students I've taught. Don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve to be here." "But they make it so hard," Emma had said, finally letting the tears fall. "I used to love English class, but now I dread coming here. I can't even sleep the night before because I'm worried about what they'll do or say." Sarah had felt her resolve crystallizing as she'd listened to Emma's words. She'd joined the teaching profession to help students like Emma discover their potential and find their voices. Instead, she'd allowed bullies to create an environment where good students were afraid to participate, and learning was secondary to survival. "You're not transferring," Sarah had said firmly. "This is your classroom too, and you have every right to be here and to participate without fear. I'm going to make sure that happens." Emma had looked at her with hope mixed with skepticism. "How? They never get in trouble for anything. They're too smart to get caught." "They're not as smart as they think they are," Sarah had replied, feeling her military training reasserting itself. "And they're about to learn that there are consequences for their actions." The conversation with Emma had been the final catalyst Sarah needed to stop treating Derek's campaign as a classroom management issue and start recognizing it as the systematic harassment it had always been. She'd spent 3 years in Afghanistan dealing with enemies who used similar tactics, and she'd been successful because she'd been willing to use appropriate force to protect the people under her care. The next few days had been a period of preparation, as Sarah had begun documenting incidents more systematically and building a comprehensive case against Derek and his followers. She'd started carrying a small notebook recording every comment, every disruption, every moment of harassment, with the precision of a military intelligence officer building a target package. She'd also begun preparing herself mentally for the confrontation she sensed was coming. Derek's escalation pattern suggested that he was building towards something more dramatic, some kind of showdown that would force a resolution to their ongoing conflict. Sarah had decided that when that moment came, she would be ready to respond with the full force of her training and experience. The final warning had come from an unexpected source. Marcus Chen, the freshman who'd been targeted by Derek's group, had approached Sarah after school on the day before the scissors incident. "Miss Mitchell," he'd said, looking around nervously to make sure they weren't being overheard, "I wanted to warn you about something. Derek and his friends were talking about you in the locker room today." "What were they saying?" Sarah had asked, though she'd already begun to suspect where this conversation was heading. "They said they were tired of you thinking you were better than everyone else," Marcus had explained, his voice shaking slightly. "Derek said it was time to teach you a lesson, to show you that you can't push them around just because you used to be a soldier." Sarah had felt her pulse quicken as she'd processed this information. Derek was preparing to escalate their conflict to a new level, moving from psychological warfare to some form of direct confrontation. "Did they say what they were planning to do?" she'd asked. Marcus had shaken his head. "Not exactly. But Derek said something about staying after school tomorrow to have a real conversation with you. He said you needed to understand how things work around here." Sarah had thanked Marcus for the warning and had spent the rest of the evening preparing for whatever Derek had planned. She'd reviewed her training, mentally rehearsed various scenarios, and reminded herself of the rules of engagement that would apply in a civilian setting. She'd also made peace with the possibility that her teaching career might be over soon. If Derek was planning some kind of dramatic confrontation, there was a good chance that her response would be viewed as excessive by administrators who didn't understand the full scope of the harassment she'd endured. But Sarah had also recognized that she couldn't continue to allow Derek to terrorize her and other students. The mission had changed from trying to reach a troubled teenager to protecting the learning environment for students like Emma Rodriguez. And protection, Sarah had learned in Afghanistan, sometimes required decisive action. The morning of the scissors incident had arrived with an atmosphere of barely contained tension. Derek had been unusually quiet during class, but Sarah had sensed the coiled energy in his posture, the way he'd watched her with predatory focus. Brandon and Kyle had been equally subdued, as if they'd been saving their energy for something more significant. Sarah had taught her lessons with heightened awareness, cataloging every detail of the room and monitoring the behavior of her three antagonists. She'd felt like she was back in Afghanistan, reading the terrain and assessing threats before a patrol. The familiarity of the mental state had been both comforting and concerning. As the school day had ended and other students had filtered out of the building, Sarah had remained in her classroom, ostensibly grading papers but actually preparing for the confrontation she knew was coming. She'd positioned herself where she could see the doorway while maintaining access to multiple exit routes. She'd reviewed her options for calling for help, and had mentally rehearsed her responses to various scenarios. The building had grown quiet except for the distant sounds of custodial staff and a few teachers working late. Sarah had felt her pulse steady as she'd entered the focused, alert state that had kept her alive during 3 combat deployments. Whatever Derek had planned, she would be ready for it. The sound of voices in the hallway had announced their arrival, and Sarah had recognized the tone immediately. This wasn't the casual conversation of students heading home. This was the focused discussion of people preparing for action, planning their approach, and coordinating their strategy. Sarah had saved her work and had stood up, moving to a position where she could respond to whatever was coming. Her military training had kicked in completely, overriding the civilian instincts that had kept her passive for so long. The scared, uncertain teacher who'd been trying to fit into a world of bureaucratic rules and limited options was gone, replaced by a combat veteran who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to face down the aggressors. The confrontation that followed would change everything at Lincoln High School, but in that moment, Sarah had felt a sense of clarity and purpose that had been missing since her arrival in Riverside. She was no longer just a teacher trying to manage difficult students. She was a protector, preparing to do whatever was necessary to keep her students safe. The voices in the hallway had grown closer, and Sarah had taken a deep breath, centering herself for the challenge ahead. Derek Williams was about to learn that some people couldn't be broken, no matter how sophisticated their psychological warfare. And the other students at Lincoln High were about to discover that someone was finally willing to stand up to the bullies who had terrorized them for so long. The war Sarah had been fighting for weeks was about to reach its climax, and she was ready to end it once and for all. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of Derek's voice echoing through the empty hallway. Her fingers paused over the stack of essays she'd been grading, her body automatically shifting into a state of heightened awareness that had become second nature during her years of military service. The building felt different now, quieter and more isolated, with most students and faculty having departed for the day. "Time to have that conversation with our favorite teacher." Derek's voice carried clearly through the thin walls, accompanied by the shuffling footsteps of his companions. Sarah could distinguish 3 distinct sets of movements, confirming what she'd already suspected. This wasn't going to be a one-on-one confrontation. Derek had brought his usual backup, Brandon and Kyle, turning what might have been a private discussion into a coordinated intimidation effort. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her mind cataloging details and assessing the tactical situation. The classroom had two exits, the main door leading to the hallway and an emergency exit that connected to the adjacent storage room. Her position at the desk gave her a clear view of the primary entrance while keeping her back to the wall. The desks were arranged in rows that could provide cover or obstacles depending on how the situation developed. She closed the essay she'd been reviewing and placed her red pen carefully on the desk, her movements deliberate and controlled. The nervous energy that had plagued her for weeks was gone, replaced by the calm focus that had carried her through countless crisis situations in Afghanistan. Her breathing steadied, her pulse slowed, and she felt the familiar sense of clarity that came when training took precedence over emotion. The voices in the hallway grew closer, and Sarah could now make out individual words in their conversation. Derek was giving instructions to his companions, his tone carrying the confidence of someone who believed he was in complete control of the situation. Brandon's responses were eager and aggressive, while Kyle's contributions sounded more hesitant, as if he was beginning to question the wisdom of their planned confrontation. "Remember what we talked about," Derek was saying, his voice dropping to a whisper that still carried enough volume for Sarah to hear. "We're just going to have a friendly conversation about how she's been treating students. Nothing aggressive, nothing that could get us in trouble. We're concerned students expressing our feelings about unfair treatment." Sarah recognized the strategy immediately. Derek was establishing a narrative that would allow him to claim innocence if the confrontation went badly. He was preparing his defense before launching his attack, a tactic she'd seen used by insurgents who would provoke coalition forces while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. "What if she tries to call security?" Kyle's voice betrayed his nervousness, suggesting that he was having second thoughts about their plan. "There's no security here right now," Derek replied with satisfaction, "and she's not going to call anyone because she knows we're not actually doing anything wrong. We're just talking to her, right? Students have a right to express their concerns about their teachers." Brandon's laugh was harsh and anticipatory. "Besides, what's she going to do? She's just a teacher. She can't touch us, no matter what we say to her." Sarah felt a cold smile touch her lips as she heard Brandon's assessment. The three teenagers had made a fundamental error in their planning. They'd assumed that her restraint over the past months was evidence of weakness rather than discipline. They'd mistaken her adherence to civilian rules of engagement for an inability to defend herself when those rules no longer applied. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and Sarah could hear the whispered final preparations of her three visitors. Derek was psyching himself up for the confrontation, his voice taking on the aggressive tone she'd heard him use with other students. Brandon was making crude comments about what they were going to say to her, while Kyle was asking questions that suggested he was still uncertain about their plan. "Just follow my lead," Derek whispered, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who believed he was about to score a significant victory. "We'll corner her at her desk, make sure she understands that we're not afraid of her military background. Show her that she can't intimidate us just because she used to be a soldier." Sarah's expression hardened as she processed Derek's words. The teenager had fundamentally misunderstood her military service, viewing it as an attempt to intimidate rather than a background that had taught her to protect others. He was about to learn the difference between intimidation and genuine capability. The door to her classroom swung open, and Derek Williams entered with the swagger of someone who believed he held all the advantages. He was followed closely by Brandon Torres, whose bulk filled the doorway momentarily before he moved to position himself near the wall. Kyle Johnson brought up the rear, his nervous energy visible in the way he kept glancing toward the exit they'd just used. Sarah remained seated at her desk, her posture relaxed, but alert. She'd learned in Afghanistan that projecting calm confidence often deterred aggressors who were looking for signs of fear or uncertainty. Her hands rested casually on the desk surface, close enough to her phone to call for help if necessary. But she already suspected that this confrontation would be resolved long before any assistance could arrive. "Miss Mitchell," Derek said, his voice carrying false politeness that didn't mask the underlying hostility. "We hope you don't mind us stopping by. We wanted to have a conversation about some concerns we have regarding your teaching methods." Sarah studied the three teenagers, noting their positioning and body language. Derek had placed himself directly in front of her desk, claiming the center of the room as his territory. Brandon had moved to her right, ostensibly examining the bulletin board but actually positioning himself to block her access to the main exit. Kyle had remained near the door, either as a lookout or because he was preparing to flee if things went wrong. "My office hours are scheduled for tomorrow during lunch," Sarah replied calmly, her voice carrying the measured tone she'd perfected during countless briefings with superior officers. "If you have concerns about my teaching, that would be the appropriate time to discuss them." Derek's smile was predatory, revealing that he'd expected this response and had prepared a counter-argument. "But we're here now, Miss Mitchell. And we've been thinking about this for a while. We believe there are some issues that need to be addressed immediately." "Such as?" Sarah asked, though she already knew this conversation was heading toward confrontation rather than genuine dialogue. "Such as the way you've been targeting certain students," Brandon interjected, his voice carrying the rehearsed quality of someone delivering prepared remarks. "Some of us feel like you've been unfair in your treatment, like you have favorites and you punish people who don't fit your idea of perfect students." Sarah recognized the gaslighting technique immediately. Derek and his friends were attempting to reframe their own disruptive behavior as victimization, portraying themselves as innocent students being persecuted by an unfair teacher. It was a sophisticated manipulation tactic that might have worked on someone with less experience in dealing with hostile interrogations. "Can you give me specific examples of this unfair treatment?" Sarah asked, her tone remaining neutral despite the obvious provocation. Kyle stepped forward, apparently emboldened by his friend's confidence. "You always call on Emma Rodriguez, even when other people have their hands up. You give her special attention and make the rest of us feel like we don't matter. And you're always criticizing our participation," Derek added, his voice beginning to carry more edge. "You act like we're stupid when we ask questions or express our opinions. You make us feel unwelcome in our own classroom." Sarah felt a surge of anger at Derek's accusations, but she kept her expression neutral. The teenagers were accusing her of the very behaviors they'd been demonstrating for months. They were projecting their own actions onto her, attempting to create a false equivalence between her efforts to maintain order and their systematic harassment. "I call on students who raise their hands and participate constructively," Sarah said evenly. "I encourage questions and discussion from everyone in the class. If you feel unwelcome, it might be because your behavior has been disruptive and disrespectful." Derek's mask of false politeness began to slip, revealing the anger that had been building beneath the surface. "See? That's exactly what we're talking about. You're accusing us of being disruptive when we're just trying to participate in class. You have this attitude like you're better than us, like your military background makes you superior to everyone else." "My military background has nothing to do with my expectations for classroom behavior," Sarah replied, though she could feel the conversation moving toward dangerous territory. "I expect all students to treat each other with respect and to contribute positively to the learning environment." Brandon took a step closer to Sarah's desk, his physical presence clearly intended to intimidate. "Maybe that's how things worked in the Army, but this is a civilian school. You can't just order us around like we're soldiers under your command." "I'm not ordering anyone around," Sarah said, her voice beginning to carry a slight edge that Derek was quick to notice. "Oh, but you are," Derek said, his excitement growing as he sensed that he was finally getting an emotional response from his target. "You think you can intimidate us with your tough military persona, but we're not afraid of you. We know you can't actually do anything to us." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly, a reaction that Derek immediately seized upon. "Look at that," he said, pointing at her face with theatrical triumph. "She's getting angry. I bet she's thinking about all the ways she could hurt us right now. Is that what they taught you in the Army, Miss Mitchell? To solve problems with violence?" "They taught me to protect people," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a warning that the three teenagers were too inexperienced to recognize. "To stand up to bullies and defend those who can't defend themselves." Derek laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "Bullies? You think we're bullies? We're just students trying to get an education. You're the one who's been making our lives miserable with your unreasonable expectations and your military attitude." "Your lives miserable?" Sarah stood up slowly, her movement controlled but somehow threatening. "You've spent months disrupting my class, harassing other students, and creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. You've made Emma Rodriguez afraid to participate, terrorized younger students in the hallways, and turned learning into a survival exercise." "That's not true," Kyle protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's completely true," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "You've been running a campaign of psychological harassment, designed to break down my authority and make other students afraid to engage with the material. You've turned education into a power struggle, where learning takes a backseat to your need to dominate others." Derek's expression shifted from false innocence to open hostility. "You can't prove any of that. You're just a paranoid ex-soldier who can't handle civilian life. Maybe you should go back to Afghanistan where you belong." The comment struck Sarah like a physical blow, targeting her deepest insecurities about her transition from military to civilian life. Derek had found her vulnerable spot and was pressing his advantage, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify whatever escalation he had planned. "I served my country honorably," Sarah said, her voice carrying dangerous quiet. "I saved lives and protected people who couldn't protect themselves. I'm not going to let 3 spoiled teenagers undo that work by terrorizing students in my classroom." "Your classroom?" Derek's voice rose with indignation. "This isn't your classroom. This is our school, and we were here long before you showed up with your military baggage and your attitude problem." Brandon moved closer, his bulk now directly beside Sarah's desk. "Maybe it's time you learned how things really work around here. Maybe you need to understand that you're not in charge." Sarah felt her training override her civilian instincts as she assessed the tactical situation. 3 hostile individuals had positioned themselves to limit her movement and were escalating their verbal aggression toward physical intimidation. In Afghanistan, this would have been classified as a pre-assault scenario requiring immediate defensive action. "I understand perfectly how things work," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a level that made all 3 teenagers take an involuntary step backward. "I understand that you've been allowed to terrorize students and teachers without consequences. I understand that you think your behavior is acceptable because no one has been willing to stop you." "No one can stop us," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to maintain his aggressive persona. "We're students. We have rights. You can't do anything to us, no matter how much you want to." "Rights come with responsibilities," Sarah replied, moving around her desk with fluid grace that suggested controlled power. "You have the right to an education, but you also have the responsibility to allow other students to learn without fear. You've abandoned that responsibility." Kyle backed toward the door, his survival instincts apparently more developed than those of his companions. "Maybe we should go," he said nervously. "We've said what we wanted to say." "No," Derek said sharply, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who sensed he was losing control of the situation. "We're not done here. She needs to understand that we're not going to be pushed around by some washed-up soldier who couldn't make it in the real army." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger, but her voice remained controlled. "I made it through 3 tours in Afghanistan, Derek. I kept soldiers alive under enemy fire. I earned the respect of my unit through competence and dedication. You've earned nothing except a reputation for cowardice and bullying." "Cowardice?" Derek's voice rose to a near shout. "You think we're cowards? You're the one who's been hiding behind school policies and administrative procedures. You're the one who's too weak to handle a few teenagers." "I wasn't hiding," Sarah said, her posture shifting subtly as she prepared for the confrontation she now realized was inevitable. "I was giving you opportunities to change your behavior before it became necessary to use other methods of instruction." Brandon apparently decided that the conversation had gone on long enough. "You keep talking about what you're going to do, but you're not going to do anything. You're just a teacher. You can't touch us." "You're right," Sarah said, her voice carrying grim satisfaction. "I can't touch you. But I can defend myself if you threaten me. And I can protect my students if you continue to terrorize them." Derek's eyes narrowed as he processed the implication of her words. "Are you threatening us?" "I'm explaining the rules of engagement," Sarah replied, her military training now fully engaged. "You can continue to disrupt my class and harass other students, but you need to understand that there will be consequences for your actions." "What consequences?" Derek demanded, his voice carrying the petulant tone of someone who'd never faced real accountability. "You can't do anything to us. Our parents will have your job if you try." "Your parents aren't here," Sarah observed quietly, "and they won't be able to protect you from the natural consequences of your choices." The room fell silent except for the humming of the fluorescent lights overhead. Derek, Brandon, and Kyle exchanged glances, apparently recognizing that the dynamic had shifted in ways they hadn't anticipated. Sarah was no longer the defensive, uncertain teacher they'd been tormenting for months. She was something else entirely, something that triggered instinctive warnings in their primitive brains. "You're crazy," Derek said finally, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. "You're a crazy ex-soldier who can't handle civilian life." "I'm a professional who's reached the end of her patience," Sarah corrected. "I've tried reasoning with you, documenting your behavior, and working through official channels. Nothing has worked because you don't respect anything except force." "We don't respect you at all," Brandon said, attempting to reclaim some of his earlier aggression. "You're nothing. You're a failed soldier who couldn't cut it in the real military." Sarah's expression hardened at the accusation. "I didn't fail at anything. I saved lives, completed my missions, and earned the respect of my fellow soldiers. I left the military because I wanted to serve my country in a different way, by helping young people develop their potential." "Well, you failed at that too," Derek said, his voice carrying cruel satisfaction. "You can't control your classroom, you can't reach your students, and you can't handle the pressure of dealing with real kids instead of mindless soldiers." "You're not real kids," Sarah said, her voice carrying finality. "You're bullies who've been allowed to terrorize others without consequences. You're cowards who attack people you perceive as weak or vulnerable." "We're not cowards," Derek shouted, his face reddening with anger. "We're not afraid of you or anyone else." "Prove it," Sarah said simply. The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence. Derek stared at Sarah, his breathing heavy with emotion, while Brandon and Kyle watched with growing unease. The confrontation had reached a point where words were no longer sufficient, where the underlying conflict would have to be resolved through action. Derek's hand moved to his backpack, and Sarah's training immediately identified the motion as a potential threat. Her muscles tensed slightly, preparing for defensive action, while her mind cataloged potential weapons and escape routes. The teenager's movements were clumsy and telegraphed, nothing like the smooth efficiency of trained combatants, but his intent was clearly hostile. "You want to see how brave we are?" Derek asked, his voice shaking with adrenaline. "You want to see what happens when you push us too far?" Sarah didn't respond verbally, but her body language shifted into a defensive posture that would have been recognized by any military personnel. She was no longer Sarah Mitchell, the struggling teacher trying to adapt to civilian life. She was Sergeant Mitchell, combat medic, trained to neutralize threats and protect others under extreme circumstances. Derek's hand emerged from his backpack holding a pair of scissors, the metal blades catching the fluorescent light as he raised them towards Sarah. The weapon was makeshift and clumsy, but it was still capable of inflicting serious injury in the hands of someone desperate or unstable enough to use it. "Now what are you going to do?" Derek demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Are you going to call security? Are you going to run away? Are you going to show us how tough you really are?" Sarah's mind processed the threat assessment automatically. One primary aggressor, armed with an improvised weapon. Two secondary threats positioned to limit escape routes. No immediate backup available. The situation had escalated beyond verbal confrontation to active threat, requiring immediate defensive action. "Derek," she said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone trained to take command in crisis situations. "Put the scissors down. You're about to make a mistake that will change your life forever." "My life is already changed," Derek replied, his voice breaking with emotion. "You've made it impossible for me to succeed in this school. You've turned everyone against me. You've made me look weak in front of my friends." "You made yourself look weak," Sarah said, her eyes never leaving the scissors in Derek's hand. "You chose to be a bully instead of a leader. You chose to tear others down instead of building them up. You chose to use fear instead of earning respect." "Shut up," Derek screamed, taking a step forward with the scissors raised. "Just shut up with your military wisdom and your perfect attitude. You don't know anything about us or what we've been through." Sarah's training kicked in completely, her body moving into a defensive stance that maximized her ability to respond to the threat while minimizing her vulnerability. She was no longer thinking like a civilian teacher, bound by bureaucratic rules and social expectations. She was thinking like a combat veteran facing an armed attacker who had demonstrated hostile intent. "I know you're about to commit assault with a deadly weapon," Sarah said, her voice carrying deadly calm. I know you're about to destroy your future over a grudge against a teacher who was trying to help you learn. I know you're about to find out what happens when you threaten someone who actually knows how to fight. Derek's hand shook as he held the scissors, his adrenaline-fueled bravado beginning to waver as he faced the reality of Sarah's transformation. The uncertain teacher he'd been tormenting for months was gone, replaced by something that radiated competence and controlled violence. "You can't hurt us," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're a teacher. You'll lose your job." "I'll lose my job anyway if I let you stab me," Sarah replied with grim logic. "The difference is that I'll be alive to find another one." Brandon moved closer, apparently deciding that the confrontation had gone too far to back down. "Derek, just do it. Show her what happens when she messes with us." Kyle, however, had apparently reached his limit. "This is insane," he said, backing toward the door. "We're going to get in serious trouble. She's going to call the police." "The police will find 3 teenagers who threatened a teacher with a weapon," Sarah said, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "They'll find documentation of months of harassment and intimidation. They'll find evidence of a systematic campaign to disrupt the educational environment." Derek's face contorted with rage and frustration. "You think you're so smart, but you don't understand anything. You don't understand what it's like to be a student in this school. You don't understand the pressure we're under." "I understand that you're using your problems as an excuse to hurt others," Sarah replied. "I understand that you've decided to solve your issues by making everyone else suffer. I understand that you've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed." The scissors gleamed in Derek's hand as he took another step forward, his decision apparently made. Sarah's training had prepared her for this moment, for the split second, when verbal de-escalation failed and physical action became necessary. "Last chance, Derek," she said, her voice carrying the finality of an ultimatum. "Put the scissors down and walk away. Choose to be better than this." Derek's response was to lunge forward, the scissors aimed at Sarah's chest, with the clumsy desperation of someone who had never been in a real fight. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a teacher anymore. She was a combat veteran who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, and she was about to demonstrate why threatening a trained soldier was the last mistake Derek Williams would ever make. Time decelerated as Derek Williams lunged forward with the scissors, his amateur attack telegraphed by the obvious shift in his weight and the wild desperation in his eyes. Sarah's combat training engaged automatically, her body responding with the fluid precision of someone who had survived countless life-threatening situations. The frightened teacher who had endured months of harassment vanished completely, replaced by Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, a combat medic who had earned her stripes in the mountains of Afghanistan. Sarah's left hand shot upward, intercepting Derek's wrist with surgical precision just as the scissors reached the apex of their arc. Her grip was immediate and absolute, controlling the weapon while her right hand moved in a swift arc that connected with Derek's solar plexus. The teenager's eyes widened in shock as the air rushed from his lungs, his body doubling over involuntarily while the scissors clattered harmlessly to the floor. The entire sequence had taken less than 2 seconds, but to Sarah it felt like an eternity of controlled violence. Derek's clumsy lunge had been so predictable, so amateur, that she had been able to neutralize the threat without causing permanent damage. Her training had taught her to use precisely the amount of force necessary to stop an attacker, no more and no less, and Derek's inexperience had made minimal force sufficient. Brandon Torres froze in place, his mouth hanging open as he processed what he had just witnessed. The tough, intimidating teacher who had seemed so vulnerable to their psychological warfare had moved with a speed and precision that defied his understanding of what teachers were capable of. His primitive brain was screaming warnings that he was in the presence of something far more dangerous than he had imagined. Kyle Johnson had pressed himself against the wall near the door, his face pale with shock and fear. The casual confidence that had carried him through months of harassment evaporated as he watched Derek collapse to his knees, gasping for breath and clutching his stomach. The dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that Kyle's survival instincts were overriding his loyalty to his friends. Sarah maintained her grip on Derek's wrist, controlling his movement while she assessed the continuing threat level. The teenager was disabled, but not seriously injured, exactly as she had intended. Her training had taught her to neutralize threats efficiently while minimizing collateral damage, and Derek's amateur assault had required only basic defensive techniques. "Derek," Sarah said calmly, her voice carrying the authority of someone completely in control of the situation. "You're going to sit down in that chair, and you're going to remain perfectly still while I decide what to do with you." Derek tried to speak, but his diaphragm was still paralyzed from the impact to his solar plexus. He could only nod weakly as Sarah guided him to a nearby desk chair, her grip never loosening on his wrist. The scissors remained on the floor where they had fallen, their threat neutralized, but their presence serving as evidence of the assault that had just occurred. "Brandon," Sarah continued, turning her attention to the second teenager while maintaining her hold on Derek. "You're going to move away from the door and sit down in the front row. Keep your hands visible, and don't make any sudden movements." Brandon stared at her with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What did you do to him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I stopped him from stabbing me," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Now sit down before I decide you're also a threat that needs to be neutralized." The coldness in her voice was enough to convince Brandon that compliance was his only viable option. He moved slowly to the front row and sat down heavily, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The teacher who had seemed so vulnerable to their intimidation tactics had revealed herself to be something entirely different, something that triggered every survival instinct he possessed. Kyle remained pressed against the wall, apparently too shocked to move. "Miss Mitchell," he said shakily, "we didn't mean for this to happen. We were just trying to talk to you. You were trying to intimidate me," Sarah corrected, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Derek brought a weapon into my classroom and attempted to assault me with it." "That's not a conversation, Kyle. That's a crime." Derek had finally recovered enough breath to speak, though his voice was strained and weak. "You can't do this to us," he gasped. "You're a teacher. You can't hurt students." "I didn't hurt you," Sarah replied, her grip on his wrist tightening slightly to emphasize her point. "I defended myself against an armed attacker. There's a significant difference, and you're about to learn all about it." She released Derek's wrist and took a step back, but her posture remained alert and ready. The teenager rubbed his wrist where she had gripped it, his face showing the first signs of genuine fear she had seen from him. The cocky bully who had terrorized students and teachers for months was gone, replaced by a scared kid who had finally encountered someone who wouldn't be intimidated. "Here's what's going to happen," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she had perfected during countless briefings with military personnel. "I'm going to call Principal Chen and report that you threatened me with a weapon. I'm going to call the police and file assault charges. I'm going to document every detail of this incident, including the months of harassment that led up to it." "You can't prove any of that," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's your word against ours." Sarah walked to her desk and picked up the scissors, holding them carefully by the handles. "These are your fingerprints on the weapon you used to threaten me. The security cameras in the hallway will show you entering my classroom after hours without permission. I have documentation of every incident of harassment you've committed over the past months." She placed the scissors on her desk and pulled out her phone, her movements deliberate and controlled. "More importantly, I have 2 witnesses who just watched you assault a teacher. Brandon and Kyle are going to have to decide whether they want to be accessories to your crime, or whether they want to tell the truth about what happened here." Brandon and Kyle exchanged glances, the reality of their situation beginning to sink in. They had come to the classroom as Derek's backup, expecting to participate in another round of psychological intimidation. Instead, they had witnessed their leader commit a serious crime that could result in criminal charges and expulsion. "We didn't know he was going to do that," Kyle said quickly, his voice shaking with fear. "We just came to talk to you about our grades. We didn't know he had the scissors." Derek turned to stare at his friend, betrayal and anger warring in his expression. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice carrying desperate threat. "Don't you dare turn on me now." "Turn on you?" Kyle's voice rose with hysteria. "You just tried to stab a teacher with scissors. You could have killed her. You could have killed us all if she had called security." Sarah watched the exchange with professional detachment, recognizing the pattern of group dynamics under stress. Derek's followers were abandoning him as soon as they realized the true consequences of their actions, a predictable response that she had witnessed countless times in military situations. "Brandon," she said calmly, "what did you know about Derek's intentions when you came to my classroom?" Brandon looked between Derek and Sarah, his face showing the internal struggle of someone trying to calculate the least damaging response. "We knew he was angry," he admitted finally. "We knew he wanted to confront you about how you'd been treating him. But we didn't know he was planning to bring a weapon." "That's a lie," Derek screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You knew exactly what we were planning. You helped me plan it." "I didn't help you plan anything," Brandon replied, his voice gaining strength as he distanced himself from Derek's actions. "You said we were going to have a conversation with her. You said we were going to make her understand that she couldn't push us around. You never said anything about scissors." Sarah nodded, understanding the dynamic that was playing out. Derek's followers were protecting themselves by portraying him as the sole architect of the assault, a narrative that would serve her purposes when she filed her report with authorities. "Derek," she said, turning back to the primary threat, "you're going to remain seated while I make my phone calls. Any attempt to leave this room will be considered an admission of guilt and will result in additional charges." Derek's face was flushed with anger and embarrassment, but he remained in his chair. The physical demonstration of Sarah's capabilities had convinced him that attempting to flee would be futile and possibly dangerous. His amateur assault had been neutralized so easily that he was beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. Sarah dialed Principal Chen's number, her eyes never leaving the three teenagers. The phone rang twice before the familiar voice answered. "Principal Chen speaking." "Mr. Chen, this is Sarah Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying professional calm. "I need you to come to my classroom immediately. I've just been assaulted by Derek Williams with a pair of scissors, and I need to file an incident report." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Are you injured?" Principal Chen asked finally, his voice tight with concern. "No, I'm not injured," Sarah replied. "I was able to defend myself and neutralize the threat. Derek is currently in my custody along with Brandon Torres and Kyle Johnson, who were present during the incident." "I'll be right there," Principal Chen said. "Don't let anyone leave, and don't take any action that could escalate the situation." Sarah ended the call and looked at the three teenagers, who had been listening to her conversation with growing dread. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in, and she could see the fear in their eyes as they realized that their actions would have serious consequences. "Mr. Chen is on his way," she announced. "While we wait, I want you to understand something. This incident didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of months of harassment, intimidation, and disruptive behavior. I have documentation of every incident, and I will be presenting all of it to the authorities." Derek's face had gone pale, the adrenaline from his failed assault giving way to the cold realization of what he had done. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just angry and scared." "You were angry and scared, so you decided to threaten me with a weapon," Sarah replied, her voice carrying no sympathy. "That's not an excuse, Derek. That's evidence of poor judgment and dangerous impulses that need to be addressed by the legal system." Brandon was staring at his hands, apparently trying to process the magnitude of the situation. "What's going to happen to us?" he asked quietly. "That depends on several factors," Sarah said. "Derek will face assault charges and almost certainly expulsion. You and Kyle will face consequences based on your level of involvement and your willingness to cooperate with the investigation." Kyle was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he contemplated the destruction of his future. "I didn't want this to happen," he said through his sobs. "I tried to tell Derek we should leave, but he wouldn't listen." "Then you should have left anyway," Sarah replied without pity. "You chose to stay and participate in an intimidation campaign that escalated to violence. Those choices have consequences." The sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway announced Principal Chen's arrival. He appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath and clearly shaken by the nature of Sarah's call. His eyes immediately took in the scene. Sarah standing calmly near her desk, Derek sitting in a chair with his head in his hands, Brandon and Kyle looking miserable and defeated. "What happened?" Principal Chen asked, his voice carefully controlled. Sarah launched into a clear, factual account of the incident, her military training serving her well in delivering a concise but comprehensive briefing. She described Derek's escalating behavior over the past months, the after-school confrontation, and the moment when he had threatened her with the scissors. She spoke without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. Principal Chen listened intently, occasionally glancing at the three students who remained silent throughout her report. When she finished, he turned to Derek with a look of profound disappointment and concern. "Derek," he said quietly, "is this true?" Derek looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "Mr. Chen, it wasn't like that. We came to talk to her about our grades, and she started acting all military and aggressive. She scared us, and I picked up the scissors to defend myself." "You brought the scissors from the art room," Principal Chen pointed out, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had dealt with too many teenage lies to be easily deceived. "I was returning them," Derek said quickly. "I found them in the hallway, and I was going to return them to the art room after I talked to Miss Mitchell." Sarah walked to her desk and picked up the scissors, holding them carefully. "These scissors have Derek's fingerprints on them," she said. "The security cameras will show when and how he entered my classroom. I have documentation of months of harassment and intimidation that led up to this incident." Principal Chen nodded slowly, his expression growing more serious. "Derek, even if your version of events is true, you had no business being in this classroom after hours without permission. Bringing any object that could be used as a weapon suggests premeditation." "It's not fair," Derek protested, his voice rising with desperation. "She's been targeting me since the first day of school. She doesn't like me, and she's trying to get me in trouble." "Actually," Sarah said, reaching into her desk drawer, "I have detailed documentation of every incident in this classroom since school started. Derek's behavior has been consistently disruptive, disrespectful, and intimidating toward both myself and other students." She handed Principal Chen a thick folder containing her careful records, and he flipped through it with growing concern. Page after page of incidents painted a picture of systematic harassment that had been building toward this moment for months. "Derek," Principal Chen said finally, "this is very serious. Threatening a teacher with any object constitutes assault. I'm going to have to call your parents and the police." Derek finally broke down completely, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. "Please don't call my dad," he begged. "He'll disown me." "I'm sorry, okay? I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "I'm sorry too, Derek," Sarah said quietly, though her voice carried no forgiveness. "I'm sorry that you chose to solve your problems through intimidation and violence. I'm sorry that you've wasted your potential and destroyed your future over a grudge against a teacher who was trying to help you succeed." The aftermath unfolded swiftly and with the precision of military operation. Police arrived within minutes, their presence transforming the classroom into a crime scene. Detective Maria Santos took statements from all parties, her experienced eyes missing nothing as she documented the evidence and interviewed the witnesses. Derek's parents arrived in a state of shock and denial, his father's face cycling through anger, embarrassment, and disbelief as he learned the details of his son's actions. The investigation was thorough but straightforward, with Derek's own friends providing testimony that sealed his fate. The school board met that evening, their decision swift and unanimous. Derek was expelled immediately, his future at Lincoln High School ended by a moment of violence that had revealed his true character. Brandon and Kyle faced lengthy suspensions and mandatory counseling, their roles as accomplices earning them consequences that would follow them for years. Word of the incident spread through the school community like wildfire, transforming Sarah from a struggling new teacher into a respected figure who had stood up to bullies when no one else would. Students who had been terrorized by Derek's reign of intimidation began to speak out, sharing their own stories of harassment and expressing gratitude for someone who had finally said enough. The culture at Lincoln High School began to shift in ways that went far beyond the removal of 3 problematic students. Teachers felt empowered to enforce their classroom rules more consistently, knowing that the administration would support them when they took appropriate action. Students felt safer reporting harassment and bullying, confident that their concerns would be taken seriously. Sarah found herself at the center of this transformation, her military background no longer a source of uncertainty, but rather a foundation of strength that allowed her to create the safe learning environment she had always envisioned. The scared, uncertain teacher who had questioned her decision to leave the military was gone, replaced by a confident educator who understood that service took many forms. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.